Welcome back to another Ret Paladin video. Verabin here. Today we're going to be talking about PvP talents in 2v2. These can vary quite a bit from comp to comp depending on who you're playing with, who you're playing against, and stuff like that. So I wanted to talk through a little bit about how I decide which talents to change, and I change them almost every single match that I play. So it's definitely not something that there's a baseline talents that you're probably going to use in most matches, but there's going to be variations that you're going to want to switch around. So we're going to take a look at those different options and why you might want to use those. So let's get right into it. Before we get started with the video, please be sure to hash that like button and subscribe for more Ret Paladin content. We're going to be doing content 2 or 3 times a week in Shadowlands, so you don't want to miss a thing. Also, check out the description in the video for links to Patreon and different merchandises that are available. There's a lot of different ways you can support the channel, including Amazon affiliates. And the way that works is you click below, and even if you don't buy the items that are linked, anything that you buy in there, proceeds of that will go to supporting the channel. So if you're enjoying the content, please consider supporting it in one of those ways. All right, so talent-wise, there are a lot of different options that you might want to pick. In the level 15 row, I normally go with Zeal. I'm actually not a big fan of Execution Sentence. I feel like we get kited quite a bit, and it doesn't really seem all that useful for most situations. Righteous Verdict is okay. It kind of depends on your comp. It might be good if you have a setup-based comp where you're able to sit on someone against melee cleaves where you're going to attack a warrior or a death knight or something like that, where you know that you can have high uptime on the target. But normally Zeal is kind of my default one. And that coupled with Blade of Wrath gives you a little bit more access to Blade of Justice. And Blade of Justice is going to generate more holy power, which gives you more either Words of Glory or Templar's Verdict, so I like that one. I normally play with Fist of Justice, but there's definitely a place for something like Blinding Light, especially if you're playing against 2 melee and you want to CC them, and you're playing with someone like, if you're playing with like a Shadow Priest or someone like that, then you can definitely have, it's good to have 2 kind of alternating CCs that you can do on 2 different people. So the Shadow Priest can fear, and then if any of them trinket, then you can wait 15 seconds, then you can Blinding Light them, and then that way they're going to sit in a CC for a while. So Blinding Light can be pretty good. I think for general purposes, Fist of Justice is actually really useful. The only time I probably wouldn't take Fist of Justice, and under normal circumstances, is if I was playing with someone like a rogue who's going to do a lot of stuns too, and I don't want my stuns to DR their stuns. So if you're playing with someone who doesn't have stuns, then Fist of Justice is going to be really good. But if they do, you might want to consider the DR. On the next row, I normally don't take Unbreakable Spirit. It might be one that you take if you're playing with a healer and you know that you're going to have longer games. So having a little bit shorter cooldown on Divine Shield and Shield of Vengeance might be useful. It's not for most games that you play, especially against double DPS. It's never gonna help you. You're never gonna get to have those cooldowns roll around again. Even Shield of Vengeance it ends up being pretty good, but even 30% on a 2-minute cooldown isn't gonna necessarily. You're not gonna get a lot of value out of it. Cavalier is one that I use against caster cleave teams. So if there's 2 different casters, that can be really good. And then Eye for an Eye is one that I use against pretty much anyone that has a physical damage. So warriors, rogues, hunters, those kind of things. It's going to reduce your physical damage taken by 35%, and it reflects some damage back, which is actually pretty good damage. It's good for dealing with pets and stuff like that. So I find Eye for an Eye actually to be pretty useful. Divine Purpose is not one that I've been taking recently in PvP. I've been leaning more towards Seraphim, and Seraphim is one that is good if you're playing with a healer, or if you think the game is going to be a little bit longer. It's going to give your 1 minute and 2 minute burst windows a lot more power. That 13% mastery is actually really, really strong. A lot of our damage is holy, so having 13%, it's almost 13% more damage. So that's really, really good. And obviously the 8 versatility is going to be good as well. It's going to give you 4% damage reduction, stuff like that. So Seraphim is actually really good. That's one I just started taking recently. I've mostly been taking Holy Avenger because the games feel like they last such a short amount of time that Holy Avenger ends up having a pretty high uptime. If it's a 1 minute game, then you've got Holy Avenger up for 1/3 of the game. So it ends up improving our strength quite a bit. and that in those time frames. So Healing Hands is one. I don't know how we ever drop Healing Hands. It is nerfed a little bit in PvP. Instead of it increasing up to 100%, it only increases it up to 70%, but that's still really, really strong. And I was in a match the other day and someone said, hey, I didn't know that you could use Lay on Hands in PvP. And I was like, that's not Lay on Hands, that's a Word of Glory, big dog. So it does heal really, really strongly, and if you're fighting someone who doesn't have a Mortal Strike effect, it ends up being really, really strong. Though my only caution with Healing Hands is that I think when you have this talent, it makes you think, hey, I should be healing a lot. But keep in mind, so much of our damage is tied up in Templar's Verdict that if you're constantly Word of Glorying, you're putting out almost no pressure. So you're kind of going into support mode, and there's definitely a time to do that, especially when you're outside of your cooldowns. But if you want to apply pressure, you really can't heal all that much. So that's just sort of a word of caution there. Sanctified Wrath is one that I would use against any team with a melee, because it's going to just do pulse kind of passive damage while you have wings up. It increases your wings duration a little bit, so that's pretty cool. So I like Sanctified Wrath a lot. Final Reckoning is one that I would use against casters who aren't going to be in melee all that much. It'll increase the damage that you deal a little bit, and it's only 30% more damage from your holy power abilities like Templar's Verdict for 8 seconds, but it is a ranged ability, so it can be kind of useful. And I used to always just take Sanctified Wrath, but I looked at some of my damage done and how my damage breakdown was against casters, and Sanctified Wrath did almost 0 damage because it only hits in melee. It doesn't say that, it says nearby enemies. What they mean is 5 yards. I mean melee range. So if you're fighting against like a mage / healer or anything like that where there's mostly casters and they're going to kite you a lot, Sanctified Wrath is going to give you almost no benefit. The 25% longer Avenging Wrath is nice, but it's going to end up not being all that great. All right, so for PvP talents, these are other ones that you're definitely going to change quite a bit. And one of the ones that I pretty much always keep is Lawbringer. And I keep Lawbringer because in some fights, when I look at my damage breakdown, Lawbringer ends up being like 8 or 9, 10% of my damage. And I don't really know how that's possible, but that's what the numbers line up with. And I think that's partially because you're hitting Judgment and Divine Toll from range a lot, and so it ends up just hitting more often than you'd think. So I feel like when I drop Lawbringer, my damage goes down a lot. So I've been using Lawbringer quite a bit. So that is one that I'm pretty much never going to change. Blessing of Sanctuary is another one that I'm finding it really hard to drop, especially against Paladins or Rogues, or even against Warlocks, because it can clear stun, silence fear, and horror effects. So it's only got a 45-second cooldown, so it ends up being up quite a bit, and it's one of those ones that you want to be careful when you use it, but I've definitely saved a lot of games, I feel like, having Blessing of Sanctuary. So that's another one that I find a hard time dropping, but there's a lot of comps that don't necessarily rely on stuns and silences and fears and stuff like that, but it is pretty common. So against almost every Paladin, you're going to want to be able to remove Hajj on your teammate, and against every Rogue, you're going to want to be able to remove Kidney Shot. So those are pretty common classes to see. But if you're playing like an Unholy Death Knight versus an Unholy Death Knight and Resto Shaman or something, you might not necessarily want Blessing of Sanctuary. They do have some pet stuns, I think, and stuff like that, but it's just not as big of a deal. So there are some comps where you wouldn't use that, but Unbound Freedom is another one that is pretty common for me to use. This setup here with these three is pretty much the default for me, but I switch them around quite a bit, and we'll talk about those situations in just a minute. So Unbound Freedom is going to increase your movement speed by 30%, and you can cast Freedom on your partner, and then that will allow you to get freedom also. And when you cast on yourself, it's going to be undispellable. So this is going to be really strong against anybody who has a lot of dispels, so like shamans and priests and mages. So against those classes, I don't know how you go without this, because those are also the classes that are probably going to kite you. And I think against someone like a druid, it might be really good too. They can't dispel, but they are going to root you a lot, so you're going to want to make sure that you can move faster and stuff like that. So I think Unbound Freedom is another really, really good one. However, there are a lot of other ones in here that I want to talk about and when you might want to use them. So Vengeance Aura is one that sometimes I will remove in place of Blessing of Sanctuary, because this one, against certain classes that do a lot of CC, like against mages, for example, this can be really, really good, because they might do they might do Ring of Frost or Polymorph, and if they're playing with a priest, for example, then you might get feared, and this ends up having a pretty good uptime. And I don't find that this stacks up all the time. It's not going to stack up to 4, and you might get 12%, increased crit chance and damage, and that sounds really, really good, but that's not a common situation. But it does end up stacking at least a couple times, and even having 3 or 6% more damage done ends up being pretty strong. So I find that one to be really good in certain comps where you don't necessarily need any of these other 3. Some other ones that I use Aura of Reckoning sometimes. Usually the fights don't last long enough for Aura of Reckoning to be all that good, but against certain comps, like against rogues, for example, they can sometimes do a lot of crits really fast. If they have like the Master Assassin Legendary, for example, and their crit chance is really high, then this could actually stack really fast. So it can be pretty good. It also synergizes with Sanctified Wrath because it's going to increase the duration of Avenging Wrath, the one that you get from Aura of Reckoning. So that's kind of good. It add a little bit of time to it, not a whole lot of time, but it's better than nothing. Law and Order is another one where if I think that I'm going to get kited a lot, this one might be pretty good because it's going to apply Hand of Hindrance, and then if Hand of Hindrance gets dispelled, then it will reduce the cooldown of it. So you're going to have more frequent access to your slows, which are actually pretty rare for us to have up. The uptime of those slows are pretty bad, so that can be really good. And then there's a few other ones that are kind of worth mentioning. If you're going to train someone, Divine Punisher can be decent because it's going to generate a lot of holy power. So I think that one is pretty good, and keep in mind that can synergize pretty well with Divine Purpose and Lawbringer. So it means that you're kind of casting more judgments, and you are going to benefit more from that. You're going to generate more holy power and stuff like that. So that can be pretty good. I've heard people say that Luminescence is kind of interesting. I don't know exactly if Luminescence is going to be one that's going to be that good. I think in PvP and in 3v3 it might be a little bit better, but in 2v2 I don't think that it's going to be all that great. You can see it's kind of better. It's probably good for BGs, but it's not. It's probably not going to be the play in 2v2. So I think that is all for the video. I just wanted to do a brief review of the talents and when you might choose one or the other under certain circumstances. If you liked the video, please be sure to hash that like button and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.